Once again, the Korean peninsula is on edge. North Korea says it'll send troops to the demilitarized border and resume military drills after it blew up a liaison office meant to facilitate talks. Just how bad is it this time, and can the tension be contained? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. It was just 2 years ago when the leaders of North Korea and South Korea agreed to work towards peace. They signed a pact to stop cross-border hostilities, and for once there was hope for reconciliation. But now, that hope, it's hard to find. Pyongyang's threatened to redeploy troops near the demilitarized border. It also destroyed a liaison office meant to facilitate dialogue because, it says, South Korea allowed North Korean defectors to drop anti-government leaflets into its territory. The government in Seoul denies that and says it will no longer tolerate North Korea's behaviour. At the moment, it's a lot of words, but could words turn into actions? More with our panel in a moment after this report from Rob McBride in Paju, South Korea.
Making its message clear and unequivocal, the destruction of the Joint Liaison Office has been widely broadcast by North Korean state-run media, accompanied by warnings that it will increase its military presence along the border separating the two Koreas. Guard posts that had been removed to de-escalate tensions will now be restored, while military exercises on the northern side of the border will be resumed, bringing this unusually strong response from the south.
Such moves thwart the efforts and achievements made by the two Koreas to maintain peace, and the North will surely pay if these measures are put into action.
The North has blamed the South for allowing defectors to release propaganda balloons into its territory. But North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is also frustrated at his failure to get more concessions in summits with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in and with US President Donald Trump. The North, seeming to conclude the current path of diplomacy, has run its course.
Trump is just not that interested anymore, and Moon is very constrained by sanctions. I mean, that's why this thing has sort of been frozen for a year and a half. I'm just not sure that much can change in the next 6 months or 8 months.
At Paju, on the southern side of the border, relatives of people abducted during the Korean War hold a simple ceremony. Many events are being staged with the coming 70th anniversary of the start of the conflict. Lee Sang-il was a baby when his father was abducted to the north. For him and others still living with the war's consequences, this latest attempt at reconciliation has achieved little.
Kim Jong-un wouldn't recognize this issue even exists, and the South Korean administration couldn't put the issue on the table during the summit in any case.
This section of the border is where rail and road links were meant to be connected if the current initiative had been a success. It was planned that Paju would become one of the main crossing points between North and South in what would be a new era of peaceful coexistence on the peninsula. They are hopes that, for the time being at least, seem dashed once more. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Paju, South Korea.
So let's bring in our panel for today, starting in Arlington, Virginia. We've got Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on US-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. In Seoul is Jun Park, political economist and next-generation researcher at the National Research Foundation of Korea. And finally, in Exeter in the UK, it's Aidan Foster-Carter, Honorary Senior Research Fellow on Korea at Leeds University. Thank you, all of you, for coming on the show today. I would say from the outset that this entire discussion will involve a fair amount of supposition, just because we never truly know what's happening in North Korea. That said, let's give it a go. Aidan Foster-Carter, I'll start with you. Defectors in the South send up propaganda balloons with leaflets, apparently, and the North responds by blowing up a liaison office. It seems disproportionate. So what do you think's really going on?
I think quite a number of things are going on. Cut me off if I mention too many. First of all, the connection that they make. I mean, it's a feeble excuse. The leaflets are a nuisance. But actually, the South Korean government was scrabbling to do something about that. Moon Jae-in, President Moon of South Korea, probably the most friendly president in Seoul that the North Koreans have ever had or now ever will have, was doing his hardest to ban it. But in a free society, it's quite hard to do that. I think they'd planned all this already. It was a carefully timed sort of step-by-step escalation day by day. And I think that they want to send a signal that they're very angry with South Korea for not being kinder to them. But what can the US do? Because UN sanctions forbid most forms of cooperation. They're cross with the US. And very briefly, there's domestic stuff as well. It's all in the name of Kim Yo-jong. That's a very interesting fact. Kim Jong-un's younger sister. She's giving orders to soldiers. I think that sets her up as a potential successor should anything happen to her brother. And finally, it's a distraction because the North Korean economy is in a mess. And what do? You create an enemy. So there's probably, obviously up to you which way you take it, but all those things are going on.
No, so many there. And Kim Yo-jong is a whole different issue, which I will look at later because she's, quite fascinating. Jun Park, I'll bring you in. Maybe just give us a bit of perspective from South Korea. Aidan said there that, President Moon is maybe the friendliest president they've had there, the most easygoing as far as negotiations go, and yet this sort of thing still happens.
I think from the South Korean side, the Blue House is undergoing discussions about realigning their main people in terms of negotiation. Yesterday, the Minister of Unification has resigned, and right now there are discussions about who another alternative team to be in discussion with North Korea and the United States.
That resignation, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because it seemed to be a sort of, how would we say, falling on his sword sort of thing. Well, this happened, so I must go. But it presumably leaves the whole idea of reunification and liaisons in a worse position when someone resigns like that.
Well, but the point here is that the Minister of Unification was not in that much of a powerful position to begin with in the negotiations. And what it looks like is that given South Korea's political decision-making structure, the Blue House and the presidential aides in the National Security Council, they had more leverage. And right now it seems that specific names were named by the North Korean side and doesn't really look like they would be welcomed in the next negotiation, if ever.
OK, Scott Snyder, we'll bring you into the conversation now from Arlington. When the North said, well, first of all, it makes this huge statement by blowing up a building, and then it talks about redeploying troops to the demilitarized border. In practicality, what does that mean? I mean, the fear is that there will be some sort of actual military flare-up there, or is this maybe just more posturing?
Well, that's right. It's a remarkable reversal from where we were 2 years ago, and it really represents, I think, the North Koreans deciding that they want to move back to the status quo ante or something similar with some possibly different features. And I think that most chilling is the North Korean Nodong Shinmun report that the Joint Chiefs of Staff is actually going to move to conduct military exercises near the DMZ. And so this really possibly puts us into a situation where we're reverting to a situation where the border is an active zone of tension, conflict, and confrontation.
And yet,
so what it really means, yes.
I was just going to say, you talked about 2 years ago. I mentioned it as well at the start of the show. That is, of course, the Panmunjom Declaration, which I had a wee look at today. And one of the paragraphs I pulled out where they said the two sides will make joint efforts to diffuse the acute military tensions and to remove the danger of war on the Korean Peninsula. Short story. Panmunjom Declaration, is it worth anything anymore?
No, that's what North Korea is doing. They're completely reversing all of the progress that has been made, limited though it might have been over the course of the past 2 years, and really putting us back to square one in the inter-Korean relationship, one of direct confrontation that incidentally also implicates the United States because USFK, the U.S. Forces Korea, are there committed to come to South Korea's defense in the event of some kind of outbreak of conflict.
Scott, I'll come back to you a little bit later on when we talk more about the United States, seeing as you've brought them up. I want to go back to Aidan just for now. If we don't have the Panmunjom Declaration, then what do we have? We have two countries technically, and I know it's a sort of throwaway line, but two countries technically still at war. What would be your fears about escalation?
Well, it obviously does carry risks. We have to wait and see, first of all. Words and deeds are not always the same thing with North Korea. The blowing up of the liaison office was a very dramatic deed on their own territory. Let's see what they actually do. They've threatened, I think there are some reports this is happening, that troops will go back into two areas, one quite near the border, the Kaesong zone, and which is the same place where the explosion took place, and Mount Kumgang. These are former joint ventures now lapsed with South Korea. And of course, along the border itself, I mean, this is sad. It only takes us back to where we were less than 2 years ago, before September 2018. But the DMZ, the laughingly named demilitarized zone, it was still the world's most heavily fortified frontier in terms of the firepower just outside it on either side. But it had made a real difference that it was, having been a quite tense place for many decades, it was a more peaceful one. Guard posts had been emptied and so on. There were even agreements, a joint excavation of military remains of people killed in the Korean War, which in the end the South Koreans were doing on their own, because the North had been shunning them for about a year before they got actually nasty this way. But obviously the South is going to have to be on its guard, and this is the game the North Koreans are playing. They want the South to be vigilant, and the South will also have to be careful if the North does actually try something. How do you respond in a way that doesn't escalate? So it's a real shame that we're going back to this kind of tension that we thought we had gone beyond.
June, would I be right in saying that the South would be unlikely to escalate? I mean, I know they already made some diplomatic overtures which were rejected already by the North. I can't see South Korea escalating quite as much as the North is. Tell me otherwise.
I think you're right in the sense that South Korea would not be violently responding to these line of events. But what's really of concern here is the presidential political life expectancy cycle, should I say. Moon Jae-in has just won a general election by a landslide, and his party has won, but given the political cycle of South Korea towards the presidential election in 2022, there's not enough time or political capital left after the failure of 3 years of failed diplomacy with North Korea, and there is not much support from the South Korean citizens to go on with this endeavor.
Right. Speaking of failed diplomacy with the North Koreans, Scott, let's talk about the United States here. I noticed the State Department putting out a statement appealing to North Korea, quote, to refrain from further counterproductive actions. That's pretty weak, isn't it, given they blew up a building, Scott?
Well, and the U.S., the Trump administration so far has been relatively quiet on this, but of course the action has been directed at South Korea. I think that the U.S. Still would like to and is leaving the door open to talks, but it's pretty clear that the North Koreans are shutting that door. And I think that really for the near term, the focus is actually going to be more on management or containment of potential tension escalation near the DMZ. And that will also involve the U.S. To some degree in support of the Moon administration's efforts in that regard.
Yeah, North Korea seems really, I mean, the language is always fascinating, but they seem really angry with the United States at the moment, because the foreign minister put out a statement, also it being 2 years since the Singapore summit, the first Trump-Kim summit, and you know, it was saying that the US was hell-bent on exacerbating the situation and turning the Korean peninsula into the world's most dangerous hotspot, and also, I mean, there's real vitriol there.
There's a lot of disappointment, I think, in Pyongyang that the gambit occasioned by summitry over the course of the past 2 years has failed to deliver sanctions relaxation, and it has not opened the door to a more firm détente between the U.S. and North Korea. I think the North Korean objective was détente, not denuclearization, but the U.S. keeps on insisting that denuclearization be a condition for détente.
So I guess what we have, and this is just a general thought to all three of you, we have a situation where there is no talking from anyone, be it inter-Korean dialogue, be it US-North Korean. There's tension all over the place. And then, Aidan, I'll come back to you for this, you bring in a new character, a new player almost, in the form of Kim Yo-jong, the younger sister of Kim Jong-un. And again, her rhetoric has been huge as well. Talking about it was sickening listening to President Moon's speech and things like that. Tell me more about her and the role she's playing right now.
Well, insofar as I can tell from a long way away, and it is we should always be clear what a difficult regime this is to read and what is knowledge and what is speculation. What is very clear is that her profile has risen markedly this year. It was only in March that she made a public statement in her own name for the first time. That was being fairly rude about President Moon Jae-in, not half as rude as she's become more recently. Then she gave another one also in March, being rather nice about Donald Trump and incidentally revealing that he'd sent a message offering to help with coronavirus, which of course North Korea claims not to have. What I do find very striking, though, is that her name specifically is all over the escalation that we've had over the past week or so. And so the situation where she, a vice director of a party department, is in effect giving orders to the military. And to make a point, of course, you also got to look where these things are. It's not just for external consumption. It's all over the North Korean papers themselves. Not on Shinmun, they tell the party paper. That is telling the North Korean people that this is a very important person. It never actually says, of course, whose sister she is, but I guess people know. And I do think, and here we go into speculation, that this is to do with the fact that if anything were to happen to Kim Jong-un, who is young but possibly not terribly healthy given his lifestyle, then, and his children are far too young. So she is, I do think, others may disagree, I don't know, that she is being placed in position just in case she's needed as a potential successor.
Jun, do you agree with that she is being lined up like that? Because it would be interesting, wouldn't it, as a potential successor, given it's been such a male-dominated society and the what's the word I'm looking for? The patriarchy of North Korea, the grandfather and the father and the son, it's all male.
Well, I think the bloodline narrative has always been very central to the North Korean regime. And given the kind of role that she has placed herself in, I think that there is a political struggle that is going on in North Korea vis-a-vis the coronavirus situation and the stalemate going on in the U.S., South Korea, China, the diplomatic context. So if with her on the horizon, if she is being placed in this kind of a pedestal, then I think this is a stage for her to debut politically and to have some legitimacy compared to her earlier appearances and events. So this may be something very, very crucial for North Korea.
Does the leadership in the South ever comment on her or talk about her? I'm just wondering how she might be viewed, because she's got, just looking at some of the pictures we've seen of her, she's got so much sort of charisma and presence about her.
I think when she visited South Korea for the Olympics and when she visited the South Korean leadership, I think when the picture was quite rosy years back, I think South Korean citizens looked at her very fondly. But in the turn of the recent events, I think that has really shocked some of the people that are especially living very close to the DMZ, and many people, not just in the policy realm, but citizens that are interested in North Korean, South Korean inter-Korean relations, they're very upset to see the tax money flow into flames, given the kind of gesture that she has shown when she was here.
Okay, so we've talked about what's happened. Let's talk about what could happen. I guess I'm talking about de-escalation here. Scott, no one wants to talk to anyone at the moment, it seems, so there would need to be some sort of broker. Who could that be?
Well, let me talk a little about risk before we talk about de-escalation, because the situation that we've painted is one where North Korea could be driven primarily by a domestic motive related to succession, in which case it's an internal priority. There is no possibility of appeasement. And if we look at what happened in the context of Kim Jong-un's preparation to be the designated successor, we saw two incidents in 2010 where the North Koreans drew South Korean blood as the basis upon which to establish Kim Jong-un's bona fides as a legitimate successor. And so the concern here is really that the North Koreans might go so far as to draw blood, putting everyone into a focus on managing and containing and trying to remove the risk of military escalation, really as the first step toward getting back to stability.
Okay, then. And so then do you want to move it on there to that idea of de-escalation or talks of some description, diplomacy of some description?
Well, I think that that's going to depend primarily on the North, because right now it's very clear that they're not in a talking mood. They're in a destructive mode. And I think that has to change first before it's going to be possible to have a profitable diplomatic interchange under these circumstances.
Okay. Aidan, could there be some influence exerted from China, perhaps? I just think of China as being obviously very important to North Korea as far as being the biggest trading partner. Just someone or some other entity to come in and just put a little bit of pressure on and say, hey, let's talk about this.
That depends. I think there is a very long history, Scott will know better than I, given where he's placed close to DC. Successive US governments have tried many different policies towards North Korea, but they've all had in common, including up to Trump at the beginning, wanting China to do something, get China on board. What this tends to ignore is that even at good times, and God knows these are not good times, I'll come to that in a second, China and the US do not have identical interests in Korea or anywhere else. China wants North Korea to exist. North Korea is a damn nuisance to China sometimes, particularly if it does things like nuclear testing, not too far from the Chinese border. And by the way, I don't rule out that might be a provocation that they might go for. But it is a buffer state. It is a relatively stable buffer state for China, which has problems on other borders, as we're seeing at the moment. China will protect the Kim Jong-un regime. Now, in better times, there was perhaps a chance that the Chinese would influence North Korea. They have, to a limited degree, implemented some quite drastic UN sanctions. We've seen how Chinese trade with North Korea, and that's about the only trade North Korea has, did actually go down after 2016. But these are very bad times, as I'm sure all our viewers are aware, between China and the US. There is not the slightest incentive that Xi Jinping, now in a very direct competition for as to who are the world's two superpowers, why would Xi Jinping lift a finger to help the United States? He will only restrain North Korea if he thinks there is an actual risk of war on the peninsula. Otherwise, I dare say that Xi Jinping is smiling at all of this, quite frankly.
Jun Park, I'll leave the final word with you as we start to run down the clock. The feeling I'm getting here is that it really all depends on the North. What sort of mood they're in? It's the unpredictable factor in all of this, and the US or Japan or China could do anything or do nothing. It will all depend on the North.
Well, I think from the North Korean side, I think what they had in mind prior to the negotiations years back, the expectations on all the sides that are in the game, they were a total mismatch. And the re-election cycle in the United States is going to make diplomacy a lot more difficult. And the Bolton book, the kind of controversy that it will bring to the previous events that occurred behind closed doors, it will cause a lot of disruption in the coming days.
Right, then we'll put a big watch and wait on this one and hopefully talk to you all about it again in the future. Scott Snyder in Arlington, Jun Park in Seoul, and Aidan Foster-Carter in Exeter. Thank you for joining us. And to you, wherever you are around the world, thank you for being a part of this show as well. You can continue that online at aljazeera.com. Our homepage is in the shows section there. Facebook.com/AJ Inside Story for more discussion. At AJ Inside Story on Twitter. and at Kamahl AJE if you'd like to get in touch with me. I'm Kamahl Santamaria from the whole Inside Story team. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.